Today is July 27th, 2017, and this is the Kubernetes meeting. This is a recorded and publicly available recording, so don't say anything you wouldn't want your grandmother to hear. All right, so we don't have a demo today, so we'll head straight to our release updates. So Jace, take it away for release 1.8.
Quick question on the recording. Are we actually recording right now?
Yes.
Okay. I don't see the little recording thing in the top.
Oh, I'm cool. Streaming with an OBS thing. It's cool.
All right, cool.
All right, Jace, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm not sure if my connection is going to be very good for this. So, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You're a little choppy, but you're still coming through.
Okay, great. So yeah, I just have a few things. It's pretty early in the release, so I just want to announce to everybody that the release team is now staffed, which is super exciting. And there's a PR out in the features repo right now that has the final version of the release team.md that has everybody's name in it. And I want to give a big thanks to everybody who volunteered, and I appreciate everyone's service in that regard. And you'll notice in there that I am the lead for this release, which is super exciting, and I can't wait to see all the great things that come up as we go through this process together. The schedule is also set, and the most important milestone at this particular moment is the feature freeze, which is on August 1st. And so as part of that, you want to ensure that if you're in a SIG, that everybody in the SIG is agreed on what they're going to be presenting as features for 1.8, and that those are detailed in the features repo. And make sure that the one-liner that you have for your feature is sufficient to give somebody the flavor and feel for feature is, because that's going to be the basis for a lot of the marketing communication that happens around the release. So we'd love to give a lot of insights into the things in each release, and that one-liner is key to that activity. So as always, it seems Ihor has stepped up to manage the features process. So if you have questions about features, what you want to have a description, just generally anything about the release from the feature perspective, you can see him. Also attends meetings, which are really insightful as well. Right now, we are reviewing a proposal in terms of tying issues back to the 1.8 milestone. And Don Chen, the release lead, has this proposal that's sort of getting circulated right now. As it stands now, there is a requirement to have a issue tied to your PR. And that actually, even if it isn't tied to automation at this moment, is helpful just to understand the context for why the PR is going in, especially because 1.8 is a stabilization release. So we want to see a lot of work tied to resolving promotion of work from alpha to beta or beta to stable if possible. So another big thing is, so SIGs need to own everything that's going to the release. So if you are part of a SIG and you have work that's outstanding or that you have intended for 1.8, please make sure that your SIG label is applied to the PR or the issue, and also in the features repo. And that will allow us to make sure that we're not missing anything, and that if we have questions, we know who to go to get those answered, especially as the release gets closer to fruition. And we're trying basically so that there's almost a one-to-one mapping between SIG activities and these everything that's happening in the release. So it's much better and easier for us to track down what needs to be done. Couple other things. We have two new roles, or actually they're not new. They're really just trying to extrapolate out some of the things that are happening every release. The marketing coordinator role is essentially so that we can have a point of contact between SIG PM and the items in the features repo and also between external marketing folks, like for example, CoreOS has somebody who's focused on marketing there, and if anybody has questions, the marketing coordinator is going to be that point of contact to make sure that everybody has what they need to do the promotion and publicity on what's happening in the release. In 1.8, that's not necessarily a huge component because it's not a super heavy feature release. But in 1.9, this role will be pretty critical and a key point in terms of the release activities, especially as things go live. So this gives us a chance to try the role out, learn from it, document it, do whatever we can to make sure that whoever is in the role next is successful. And if it's not a role that is useful, we won't continue it, but I'm anticipating that it'll be very useful. And it's basically the same thing goes for release notes coordination. And the release coordinator role is just to make sure that all the and the T's are crossed as far as completeness in release documentation, and that we have a good draft to review ahead of the release and all that good stuff. So any questions on those so far? All right, lastly, I have put a Kanban board for the release, and my goal is to provide a single view of the release at any given moment. So if you're curious what milestones are coming up, what activities are happening in the release, if there are issues or blockers that come up, those will show up on that board, and we'll basically be tracking there. For me, this is how I manage my work from day to day, and I find it very useful, and I'm hoping that this view is also useful for the community at large. And this is something that I think could be tremendously valuable, especially as we have a lot of more breaking out of the repositories and all the distribution of work, because this will be a single point to unify all those release activities and also blockers, and also opportunities for integration. So hopefully that will stay updated. I anticipate it so. It's a little tricky because it means that there will be issues in the SIG release repo that might not normally be seen as traditional issues, but they'll really be intended to be cards on the Kanban board. So I will see how that works, and hopefully this will be of value to the community. And I believe that is it for 1.8. Any questions?
Awesome. Thank you, Jace. Doesn't look like we have anything in chat either. So with that, we will move on to patch releases. All right, so first up, we've got the 1.7.3 patch.
I don't know if Wojtek's here.
Yeah. It's a little bit late for some of those folks. So I think we'll go on to the 1.6.8 patch with Anthony. Anthony, you around? All right. Looks like no Anthony either. So I'll just read off the notes. The 1.6.8 patch is planned to be cut Wednesday, August 2nd. So just keep that in mind. All right, and then we'll head on to SIG updates. So it'll look like first we have SIG Contributor Experience with Garrett. Garrett, you there?
Everyone. Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Awesome.
Loud and clear.
So this is Garrett, and I want to go over some of the things that we've done over the last few months with Contrivex. There's kind of been some work done on both the automation side and on the policy side and documentation. Those were some of our goals for 1.7. So we tried to make sure that the bot commands were documented and more easily discoverable. I didn't actually get a chance to link to the PR, but there is work done so that whenever the bot leaves a comment, there's a link back to all the commands that you can use that are associated with the bot. And we can try and keep that updated so that it's clear what you can and cannot do with bot commands. We also had a PR to try and speed up PR review velocity by pinging inactive reviewers and then suggesting additional reviewers that can get your PR moving. So we're not unassigning anybody. There was some pushback on taking a PR review away from somebody, but instead we're just suggesting other people that can also review using Blunderbuss and the owner's files. We also had a couple of people work on putting together an issue triage guideline, and these are some of the things surrounding getting them routed to SIGs, closing support issues. I linked the PR there if you want more information. And we had a couple of people update the issues template, or multiple templates, both the issue template and Kubernetes tried to simplify that because it was getting deleted frequently. And the features repo template as well is now a lot shorter and simpler. Upcoming work. The most important thing, I think, for the quarter is going to be metrics. So when we talk about some of these policies, updating the issue template, for example, or pinging inactive reviewers or requiring an associated issue, any of those things, we don't really have too much of an idea of how that's impacting the project's velocity and health. And I know that there have been a number of efforts to pull out metrics. There's a tool called Velodrome in the test info repo. Biturgia has a dashboard. The submit queue has some information. In Contributor Experience, we're talking with a third-party company called Sappho that has ideas for dashboards and visualizations. But the goal is really to make it so that anyone can come up with metrics and propose metrics and get them created, and make sure that it's kind of an open process and it's easy to learn how to add your own metrics. So that's one of the things that we're working on. The other kind of theme is consistency. So we're looking at standardizing the labels across all the repos. There's a PR out for that right now. It kind of got stuck, and we're pushing it through a little bit more. And these aren't all labels from the Kubernetes repo, but there are a subset that should be available throughout the project. For example, the SIG labels, the kind labels, LGTM probably, approve, and a few others. So there's some work being done there. We're trying to get the bots turned on in more of the repos. We're starting with community right now. And we're probably also going to need to define the process for turning the bots on everywhere. Additional documentation. And then, as Jace mentioned earlier, it's up to the release team to define and continue supporting some of the release policies. If we're going to move forward with Don's proposal, which it sounds like we are going to help with some of the automation surrounding the automatic generation of release notes. And I think along those lines, there was an issue in test infra surrounding making these things configurable, though, so that the bot can work in other repos a little bit more clearly. So we're going to try and make the bots, or at least the approver bot, a little bit more configurable and useful. So that's kind of what we have going right now for Contribex. That's all I got. Solly, you look frozen to me. You still there?
I'll step in real quick. We'll go ahead and move on to Justin Santa Barbara for SIG AWS.
Hey there. Yep, I was going to jump in, but thank you. Yes, so representing SIG AWS today. We have big news is we have a new SIG lead, Luis Pabon from CoreOS. So welcome to him. I don't know if he's on the call, but welcome. Yay. I'd say in AWS land, the cloud provider is actually relatively stable, which I think is a good thing, i.e. there's not a lot of, by stable I mean like there's not a lot of code churn going on in it. I'm not trying to imply anything about its reliability, but it is actually really good. I think we have made a lot of improvements, for example, on EBS volumes, which have been a bit of a problem area for the past couple of releases. So those are looking reasonably good in 1.7, still a couple of issues, but looking pretty good. And there is some work going on tagging of resources so that when Kubernetes creates a resource in AWS, it is tagged appropriately. But I think the more interesting thing is that the majority of the work on AWS is actually happening in other repos now, rather than being in the Kubernetes repo. So there's some good stuff happening in the external DNS project involving how to configure Route 53 for DNS names, and I think there are 2 AOB ingress controllers. So we don't necessarily have to do everything in Kubernetes, and I think we are doing well on that front. I guess the weakness is that, of course, we have 2 AOB ingress controllers. We would ideally like to have 1. Props is another example. I think the major thing that I personally think is the biggest thing we have to fix is the IAM issue. In other words, our pods currently typically inherit the IAM permissions of the node. There's a solution called Kube to IAM, which most of the community seems to have adopted. We've blessed that in the SIG, I guess, and there's also the identity working group spinning up, and hopefully we can get Kube to IAM fitting in that framework and have a really nice integrated solution that is sort of a first-class Kubernetes citizen. I think that's all I've got. And yeah, we have meetings every other Friday. I think not this Friday, but the other Friday. And we have a Slack channel, and you're welcome to come hang out if you use Kubernetes on AWS, or even if you don't. That's all I got.
Solly, are you back yet as our host?
I am back.
Okay, cool.
Sorry about that. Zoom decided that it wanted to crash my laptop entirely, which is wonderful. All right, where were we? Did Justin go for SIG AWS?
Yep. We're on announcements now with Aaron.
All right. So, announcements. Is Aaron here, actually?
I am. Hi, I'm Aaron Berger. So I wanted to talk briefly about email I sent out to Kubernetes dev earlier this week around the idea of the Kubernetes project dropping support for etcd2. For those of you who haven't had time to read the email, the case I'm making is that our documented support policy says we only support 3 minor versions. So when we release Kubernetes 1.8, we drop support for Kubernetes 1.5. Kubernetes 1.5 was the last release to default to etcd2 for new clusters, and Kubernetes 1.6 was the first release to default to etcd3 for new clusters. As you may be aware, the release team uses upgrade tests as part of its go, no-go signal for whether or not to cut a release. So those upgrade tests for the 1.7 release team were from 1.5 to 1.7, and for the 1.8 release team, they will be from 1.6 to 1.8. This means if we stand up a cluster in its default configuration, we will not be testing etcd2 at all. So from the perspective of a member of the release team and attempting to reduce surface support or support surface area, I'd like to highlight the fact that we're not planning on using any etcd2 related tests as part of our release signal. So when we say that the Kubernetes project supports etcd2, some of you may be surprised to learn that previous releases have been cut with decreasing levels of coverage of etcd2 functionality. And I'd like us to come out and call it for what it is, that it's about a year or so since we've been supporting etcd2 as the default configuration, and it's time for us to drop it. So part of the problem here is we as a project don't have an official policy for what our deprecation policy or support policy looks like for the versions of third-party components upon which we depend. This includes etcd, but could also be tied to things like CNI plugins or the particular container engine that we're running. I tried to raise this issue at SIG architecture, asking for some guidance on perhaps what's the broad policy we want for third-party dependencies. This is ordinarily the sort of thing I would raise to the steering committee. But as we don't have the steering committee as yet, I'd like to raise this issue to the community and decide whether or not we can find a SIG to own this, or if we decide we need to spin up a working group to do this. Because when I raised it at SIG architecture, there were a couple raised eyebrows. I think Justin articulated a point just a couple minutes ago on that thread pretty well, that there's a big checklist of things somebody who's very dependent on etcd2 might want to see done to gain confidence that we have fully thought through the etcd2 to etcd3 upgrade path. And if you look at our upgrade tests, for example, they haven't been passing for quite some time. And there's a fantastic checklist that Justin proposed that I have seen no action nor input on. So if we as a project care about supporting etcd2 going forward, or carrying out a nice user-friendly deprecation policy, we ought to staff that or decide if that's the appropriate checklist. And we ought to find a SIG to drive that effort. But the reality is, at the moment, I haven't seen anybody stand up and take care of that. So how do people feel about my proposal, where we call it what it is and suggest that this is the last release that quote unquote supports v18, but we don't change our level of test coverage at all. And then in some future release, we drop support for etcd2.
I can jump in and give a little bit more background, I guess, which is like when we first adopted etcd3, there was a migration approach that was recommended. We discovered sort of late in the day that there were some snafus with that in some scenarios, like HA. COPS, for example, decided not to adopt etcd3 until those had been resolved. They're not under testing yet, so we have not made any progress on adoption of etcd3. The quagmire we're in is we figure at some stage there will be an automated update solution, and if we already have two scenarios, etcd2 and etcd3, and if we have etcd3 manual and etcd3 automated upgrade, then we have like 3 scenarios. So that's why COPS is holding on etcd2. I would say that we should deprecate etcd2 and start the clock, but I think we should continue with our deprecation policy on something as important as, where our data lives. And I'd say like 2 things, one of which is like the default is not the right thing to do, because, well, actually, so the default, we should not have switched, according to our deprecation policy, we should not have switched the default at all. We should have stuck the default on etcd2. So looking at the default is the wrong thing to do. Otherwise, we would not be on etcd3 at all. The other thing is that etcd2 and etcd3 are basically complete different data stores. They have nothing in common. It is not a version upgrade. So we added support for etcd3, and like when we add support for console or cockroachdb, right? That doesn't mean we remove support for etcd3. So those would be my arguments against, but we do have to, we should, so I would propose that we deprecate etcd2, get the testing working, get the clock started, but we only actually remove support when we have an upgrade strategy that works for our users and works.
So I want to get into something Aaron said that is, I think the crux of this issue is that the support of the deprecation policy, or that you're sort of proposing, Justin, is unfunded. It's an unfunded mandate. There is nobody on track to pay for that work, in terms of hours or dedication from a SIG that's willing to just step up and own it. So this is something that is just generally something that we as a community need to solve, is the unfunded mandate problem. This is one of those things where the lazy consensus is that the release is just going to roll out without etcd2 support, just because that's the way the inertia is rolling. So we need to, if somebody's passionate about that and taking care of that, we need to actually have somebody stand up like right now and say, I got it, and actually carry the ball through the end of the release.
Well,
Point me to where this deprecation policy is that applies in this situation. Because the only deprecation policies that I see relate to API fields and the CLI. I don't actually see any sort of documented deprecation policy for this case.
So that's part of what my concern was. And I linked to this. It's the first length link in the email thread that I sent out to Kubernetes dev. So if you're looking at the community meeting notes, I linked to that thread. And then if you look at footnote 1, that should take you to supported releases and component versions queue. And so that, as far as I know, is the only documented deprecation policy we have for Kubernetes as a whole, not as it relates to API fields. And so if I use the reasoning that releases of Kubernetes have started to call out which external dependency versions they are validated against. So to use Jace's term, Google has put some funding into exercising automated testing against these particular versions, right? Then etcd3 is what's being validated right now. And so etcd2 was the last thing that was validated during 1.5. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought midway there.
When we turned on etcd3 support, though, I was under the impression that we also kept running tests against etcd2 because the plan was both to switch to default but not drop support, right? And I think that what you're implying is that we sort of did drop testing coverage, which implicitly is dropping support, and I'm not convinced that is the case.
And yes, that's what I'm saying happened. I see you raising your hand, Joe, but let me just be clear. Yeah, testing is what has dropped, right? The code to actually talk to etcd2 is absolutely still there, but nobody's checking to see if it works anymore.
Well, COPS is, right? All of the COPS tests are still using etcd2.
Yeah, and I volunteer to get testing working with etcd2, but I do not volunteer to do the deprecation. But I will fix the tests so that we have coverage, which I thought we had. So hopefully it will just be a matter of fixing it and marking them as blocking.
Yeah, announcing the deprecation makes sense to me. I put this issue of coming up with a formal policy on the Sig architecture backlog, but there is a pretty significant backlog, so I didn't get to it yet. And we have the general problem that unless someone strongly cares about something, even if the tests run, they don't necessarily pay attention to whether the tests are passing. So that's a general problem we need to figure out how to solve. On the other data stores issue, I expect we eventually may support other data stores. Right now, we can't afford the increasing complexity in the test matrix, and we haven't had time to really pin down the storage API. There are features of etcd3 we would like to take advantage of, which is going to make etcd2 not work. So, we need to have settled the official policy on it before then. And this is also why we didn't merge the console API. Like, I would really love to be able to break individual resources into multiple records in etcd. And that's something we could do with etcd3 that we cannot do with etcd2 very easily. So, yeah, I expect, announce deprecation, otherwise continue status quo, but communicate what the status quo is more clearly.
Okay, I see Joe raising his hand.
Yeah, I think that I read through the deprecation policy while we were having this discussion, and there's an implied idea of a user in the deprecation policy that I don't think we're really clear about. The user from the point of view of something like GKE is the end user who's actually running workloads on top of Kubernetes. etcd hits the operations person, the person actually operating the cluster, which is in some ways a different user, and it feels like the deprecation policy hasn't taken that into account. So I think it's clear for us. I'm not sure where we take care of this. Maybe this is SIG architecture. Maybe this is the steering committee. But I think looking at the deprecation policy in terms of which features are user facing, which features are operations featuring, do we actually have the same deprecation policy across all of these? I think that there is this assumption implied that operators can take more pain. I don't know if that's something that we actually want to live with.
It's actually true and deliberate that things that affect operators, like changing the flags on API server or something like that, we're willing to induce more pain there. Partly so that we can move faster and clean up debt, but just as a practical matter, there are going to be more applications that are built that embed the API than cluster turn up automation.
I'm not disagreeing with that, Brian. What I'm saying is that we should bring clarity to the deprecation policy. As we segment users, we talk about which surface area applies to which users and how we have different deprecation policies for those different surface areas.
I totally agree with that.
I agree. This is Don, and I agree with we should have the more clear of the deprecation policy and include of even the node versions. Our own development is not like dependency, so we are not clear. I think that in the 1.0 release, I sent out an email say about some of those kind of things actually unclear. So another thing it is actually I can clearly see this one for the etcd one, and we don't have the owner. Who is the owner? It is driven by use cases. So someone think about, oh, because there's some test, like everyone based on the SIG group or users' interest. Like for example, obviously Aaron, because he's in charge of the testing in general. So he see those tests is fail and nobody owns those kind of things. So he will raise, we should deprecate. And there's no clear deprecation policy to driving the decision. He raised this one just because that it is not properly seen. And Justin have from the AWS and the COPS and the use cases, he feel he need this kind of things. So I think this is not sustainable. We should have the clear ownership, just like Docker. We just signaled, we just claim we own that deprecation policy. We own the responsibility. So we own the testing. And so we have to in charge like every single things. So we need to do validation and the quantification. I think the ownership is more important besides of the, of course, the deprecation policy, it is important, but the deprecation policy also will will be adjusted by the owner, like the nodes. A lot of people ask us, we should support more than 3 Docker version. We just couldn't. And just giving all the engineering resources, we couldn't. So we have to keep moving the minimum support of the version. I think the same thing for etcd. Also, we need to have the ownership, identify which C group own that one, then move forward.
I could not possibly agree more with what Don is saying with regards to who actually owns this. And that's particularly why I am raising it in this forum. There are a number of SIG leads here. The genesis of bringing etcd3 forward was largely pushed by SIG Scale. I heard during the SIG architecture meeting that SIG API machinery is in charge of all of the interactions between the API server and the quote-unquote registry. I heard that SIG cluster lifecycle is in charge of the lifecycle of a cluster through all of its upgrades. And I've heard that SIG testing is in charge of making sure that all the tests pass, which is false. We just run your tests. We do not actually write your tests for you, okay? I'm really, oh, and let's not forget that SIG release maybe should own what the supported releases policy is, but we're wildly understaffed right now. SIG releases mandate has kind of carried up to the cutting of the release. It hasn't really moved beyond to the support of the release and the end of lifing and sunsetting of the release, so on and so forth. This is totally something I would be escalating to the steering committee. But in lieu of that, I'm here to ask everybody here what we think we should do going forward. So, and I just personally, I'm okay with, yeah, calling the status quo what it is and saying there's really just not that much test coverage. George, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I feel like, so you posted your message to Kubernetes dev, and we know how developers use it. We know that people who are paid to work on public clouds are paying attention to this kind of stuff. But I feel like we have a hole as far as everybody else who's using Kubernetes. And I feel like it would be nice to get another data point. You know, perhaps we can socialize via the Twitter account and have all the famous people retweet it. How many of you out there are still using etcd2 in production? Just as another data point.
So who is the SIG that would own soliciting that feedback, gathering it, and summarizing it, and factoring it into this?
Well, technically it should be SIG cluster ops, but frankly, we've had trouble trying to sustain membership. So that if we say it's a mandate for that SIG, that's great, but honestly, it's not going to get that wide of an audience. So I have pulled the fire alarm on this problem multiple times that we are becoming an echo chamber for developers, and real world cluster operators are getting left out of a lot of key decision and discussion. So we need to solve this problem. This is a way larger problem than deprecation. This is how do we communicate with the people who are actually impacted by the decisions that we make.
Yeah, I agree. And for what it's worth, I went SIG architecture, a small group of people looking for that deprecation policy first. Now we're dev, and now we're at the community meeting where theoretically people who are developers and also people who are consumers of Kubernetes are. So we are widening this circle and talking about it, but I agree, there's more that could be done, and this is a large issue.
Some people just showing up for more people doing demos and talking about operations and big cluster ops will help us build critical mass from that perspective, right? We have the conversations, we just need more people to participate.
But so I'm interested in actionable decisions here, folks. Are we all okay with 1.8 going out the door with a level of testing that is, apparently some tests may have etcd2, but we're not sure, and COPS might be the last representative of etcd2 compatibility?
Well, I volunteered to get our etcd2 testing up. It feels like, as you say, there is an unfunded mandate to deprecate etcd2, and if someone wants to volunteer to do that, then I propose that they put their money where their mouth is, I guess.
I would encourage also for us to reflect some of what we've talked about here onto Aaron's Kubernetes dev thread, because obviously there are people in the community that are not at this meeting. Some of the patch managers, for instance, just as a concrete example. And it's good to have kind of a mailing list discussion area forum for this that's a little bit less real time.
That's a very good point, Sally. Thanks. I see in the chat that ACS uses etcd2. Is etcd2 testing something that Azure could fund?
I'm going to look into that. I don't think we should be using etcd2, actually. I was kind of shocked when I found that out.
Well, I guess that's another solution. But yeah, and the chatter seems to be that neither OpenShift nor GKE are using etcd2. And we're funding a lot of the project as it stands. I can't imagine where we get headcount to do more work on etcd2, given that it's not part of our product. We're stretched really thin.
I think the one test that scares me is the etcd2 to 3 upgrade testing. That's the one I think that's really broken. Am I right on that, Aaron?
Yeah, I see. So they're both scheduled to run every 2 hours, but I see 0 results for that on the master branch, and the 1.5 branch has been failing in perpetuity, and I don't see anything on the 1.6 or 1.7 branches for that.
So it sounded like Justin volunteered to help out with getting that up and running again.
Yeah, I'll definitely do the etcd2 tests. I will try my best on the upgrade, but
yeah, I don't think he volunteered for upgrade because that's a whole different kettle of fish. Stinky fish.
Yeah, like I guess sort of what I interpreted you to say, Justin, is I will continue to ensure that COPS runs effectively with etcd2. So if COPS breaks and it's an etcd2 specific thing, I will take the initiative to fix that.
Yes, I will also, for my own sanity, I'll also like try to get another test running with etcd2, so we have another delta rather than, so we don't have COPS and etcd2 versus etcd3, but I'll try to get another test running as well.
Joe, your hand is up.
Yeah, I think, with respect to deprecation policy, that's an SLO. It's an objective. There's going to be times when we actually don't hit that objective. I mean, a concrete thing we can do is just document the fact that etcd2 over time is actually, even if not officially, is in effect sort of on its way to being deprecated and, may not last out the full deprecation policy just because it's underfunded. It's not ideal, but I think it's better to be honest with users about where we're at versus, pretend that something is what it isn't.
Who would you propose owns that particular action item?
Well, I think who owns the relationship between Kubernetes and etcd? I mean, they should be documenting the requirements around that. I think just like testing is not a centralized responsibility onto SIG test. I think the practicalities of running and maintaining a cluster over time is a shared responsibility across the entire project. We can't have something like API machinery who ostensibly owns this relationship, say, well, figuring out how to deploy this thing is somebody else's problem.
Right, and along those lines, like upgrade testing, the framework is owned by cluster lifecycle, but if you create an object, you are responsible for making sure it can be upgraded across releases. Right, it's not cluster lifecycle's problem if your upgrade tests are failing, it's your problem.
I agree with everything you're saying, but I cannot help but perceive this as everybody pointing at everybody else.
So far, I've heard everybody pointing at API machinery and them not pointing elsewhere, but maybe they're not here to represent themselves.
I think this just points in the direction that just having clear lines of ownership over time towards SIGs is the way that we want to go. We can all say, I think the first thing is let's agree on which SIG it is, and then let's figure out what we can do to incentivize that SIG to actually step up and take responsibility.
So API machinery actually worked on the existing upgrade mechanism.
I think the API machinery is the good ownership to own the integration, validation, and all those kind of things with the new storage, whatever, because they are talked there and they know a requirement for all those kind of things. And back to the deployment at CD, the new version of those storage, should we own the cluster ops? But it's a separate story. So I think that we should start with the API machinery. So they should take this ownership and decide what it is they want to support, which version they should support at least. And like what's the range of the version? What's the minimum version? They make those policy. And then we talk about, okay, what's the requirement, all those kind of things, and then come up the test. And the cluster ops, it will be on cluster, whatever is class lifecycle or cluster ops need to figure out it is the deployment in the real production and have like the real product and deployment story. That's kind of separate things, but I think the major ownership, it is API machinery.
Great. So now that we have a tentative answer as to who should probably own this in API machinery, I think we should move probably the rest of this discussion to the mailing list.
I agree. I thought it was really helpful to have a lot of quick, fast feedback with a lot of the key players here. So I want to thank everybody for participating. My final question is this the sort of thing that should be tracked via a feature issue and tied to the release that way? Or is this a separate effort?
I think we tie it specifically to the upgrade test failing. So basically, the issue is that the etcd2 to etcd3 upgrade test is failing. So let's tie it to something concrete that we can actually throw stones at.
I would say that it also makes sense to actually have, this is where the name feature really doesn't work, an issue there that actually tracks deprecation of etcd2, right? And we can put together the checklist of what does it take to actually be able to do this, and at least be honest with where we are along that.
Yeah,
well,
that's
so
our primary effort tracking mechanism.
What's that?
That issue exists, and it was created by Justin, and it lives in the Kubernetes repo, and it could probably have a little more clarification on it.
I was going to say Justin has a good list of stuff that should be taken care of there.
So it's just, I want to illustrate that for those of us who have participated in the release notes process, I have a little paranoia about making sure such a thing is effectively communicated in the release notes.
I think it's probably reasonable to have an issue in the features repo, because that does seem to be one of the easiest ways for us to see high level overview. These are the major changes. It's not necessarily a feature, it's almost like the anti-particle version of a feature, but I think that's a reasonable place to put something.
I'm not sure on that. I think that's polluting the waters of the feature repo a little bit. I think that let's take this into the developer group and hash it over. But just to recap what we've decided, we definitely need to have a good deprecation policy that's enforced in some mechanism and is not unfunded. And for the auspices of the 1.8 release, we will attempt to rely on secondary or tertiary tests that hit etcd2, and we're going to try and see if we can find some work to get that upgrade test in place so that we're not just dropping hot potato before the 1.8 goes out. The asterisk behind that is that it's not working now. It didn't work for 1.7, and so I'm going to have a hard time making that a release blocking effort.
All right. Great summary for me. Thanks, Chase.
And I think that's the end of the announcements, except that I would like to remind people, if you are a SIG lead and have not signed up to host this meeting, you should definitely do so. It looks like we're missing a host for August 10th. And then besides August 17th, the rest of the calendar going forward is free. So definitely sign up. It's fun to host the community meeting, and it helps take the burden off of our community managers. So definitely do that. And with that, I think we can give everybody back 15 minutes, unless anybody has any last questions or comments.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for hosting.
All right.
Thursday.
Yep. And thanks to George for taking notes. And we'll see you next week.
Okay, bye.
See you.